I'm going to give you the official introduction. And so I'm going to read this, but I'm going to give you a little more than this. So our next speaker, who's also brought his lovely wife, Sherry, with him today, it brings a deep aviation experience and profoundly personal perspective on safety. This is an aviator's aviator right here. Tim Lilley is a 20-year U.S. Army aviation veteran, former EMS and regional airline pilot, now captain flying the Praetor jet for FlexJet. Today, he speaks to us not only as a pilot, but as a father. I'm going to let Tim and Sherry tell you the story. Excuse me, but from a personal perspective, it's been our pleasure to kind of get to know them on a deeper level, and I think you're going to enjoy what they have to say. So, welcome, Tim and Sherry Lilley. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Hey, we appreciate the chance to come up here, and it's kind of therapeutic for us to tell this story. I don't know how many people in here have lost a child, but when you lose a child and it happens to be in your line of work, it really hits home. Let's see if I can figure this out. All right. So just a little bit about myself, why my perspective is kind of so unique. I spent 20 years flying Blackhawks for the Army, and 4 of those years flying in and out of the Pentagon. So I've flown these routes that we're going to talk about literally hundreds of times, probably 2 or 3 times a week for 4 years straight. When I retired from the Army, I spent some years flying EMS, and then I flew for 121 for just a very short time, got furloughed from COVID, went back to helicopters, and ended up at FlexJet where I'm at now. I love my job at FlexJet, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the reasons why coming through this presentation. But I want to talk about Sam a little bit, because what's important here is not just the cost of safety, it's the financial cost. It was suggested to me by a high-ranking military official that a cost-benefit analysis would say $11 million is what a human life is worth. I can tell you right now, my son and your son is worth a lot more than $11 million. If I had all the money in the world, I would give it up today to have Sam back. So Sam was 28 years old. He partied his way through college, right? He wasn't going to be a pilot like his dad, but he had a great college career, and he was going to go into marketing. He worked in marketing for just a couple of months. And when he got into that field, he called me up one day and he said, "Dad, marketing's not for me. I want to be a pilot like you." And I was so proud and I was so happy. I said, "You knucklehead, we should have had this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, you know." But once he decided he wanted to be a pilot, he pursued it aggressively. And so even with COVID, in just a few years, he was flying for regional airline. He and I shared a lot of passions together, not just flying, scuba diving, and traveling. This kid had used his travel benefits to go all over the world in a couple of years that he worked for PSA and American Airlines. He'd been to Ireland, he'd been to Japan, he'd been to Iceland, Spain, all these places. So, he had a great life going ahead of him. He had just proposed, and they were going to get married in the fall. And we just really loved Lydia. We would have really been interested to see where that family went. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the aircraft, but a lot of people ask me this, and so I thought we could talk about it a little bit, like how did we find out that what happened that night? So I'm working for FlexJet, and I was in Teterboro. I was on a trip, and I had like a 5 o'clock show in the morning, really early in the morning. I come out of the shower, and I'm watching, the news is on, and I see, oh man, there's been an aircraft accident. Well, aircraft accidents interest me, right? I'm gonna make a confession to you guys. I'm the guy who safety's been important to me, but I'm more of a doer. I'm more of a get the job done. I'm the guy who works 220, 240 days a year and never calls out fatigue. I'm the guy who only puts in a safety report if I feel like that I'll get dinged if I don't. Okay, my attitude has changed considerably in the last few months. I'll give you an example. Just about 10 days ago, I was flying into Boca. I was given a descent from ATC, which ended in a resolution advisory. Had to do the climb thing, right? So 3 months ago, I would not have put in an event report. It's not required at my company unless I had been at the wrong altitude, which I was not. But instead I said, this data is important. I'm gonna go ahead and put this report in. And I put that, I had like a couple hours on the ground in Boca, so I put it in right then and there. Somebody from my safety department called me up probably 15 minutes after I pressed send and started going over that incident with me. And then it showed up in the next newsletter. Boca's a hotspot. We've had all these RAs. So this is the kind of thing where this data that we're talking about and this reporting that we're talking about is super important. But anyway, getting back to the story. So I'm in Teterboro. It's you know, late in the evening. I see on the news there's been an aircraft accident. It doesn't take me long to figure out it's PSA, who my son flies for. Automatically, I want to talk to Sam about this accident. That's what we do. When aviation stuff happens, we talk about it. So I start texting him, hey, you know what happened? No answer. He only doesn't answer my text usually if he's asleep or he's flying. He turns his phone off when he's flying. That's what we're supposed to do. So maybe he's out flying. Just about 3 months earlier, he got a new phone. Up until then, I had him on Find My Friends. I could have seen where he was at, you know, if his phone was on, but he got wise to it. So anyways, he's not answering his text. So I called my wife and I said, hey, I knew he was out on a trip. I didn't know what his actual legs were. So I called my wife and said, hey, you know where Sam's at? What happened?
So the funny thing about that Find My Friends is we have a 27-year-old and then Sam was 28. And like Tim said, he was still on Find My Friends. And when he got his new phone, Tim said, oh, we can't track him anymore. And I said, well, he is a grown man, so that's probably okay. But when he called me that night and said, where is Sam? I said, I don't know. I said, I know he's on a trip because I had looked at a wedding venue earlier that day for him and Lydia. She was in Charlotte where they lived together. And so I texted her and I said, where is Sam? And she said, I told you he's on a trip. He ends the day in Columbia. He'll be home tomorrow. She was thinking I was pressuring her about putting the deposit down on the venue I had looked at for that, you know, for them that day. And Tim had actually called me at that point, and we were on the phone, and I was texting her. And I then texted her. I was like, I'm just going to have to ask her if he's flying into D.C. And I had actually gotten on Reddit, and I had gotten the flight number for the aircraft by this point. So we knew the tail number, we knew the flight number. I had looked on the American Airlines app. I knew that that flight started in Wichita. It was one nonstop a day from Wichita. So I said to Lydia, is Sam in D.C.? And immediately my phone rang with her calling. And I said to Tim, hold on a second, I'm going to bring her into this call. And as soon as she joined the call, she was terrified. She knew something was up. And she said, why are you asking me that? And I said, honey, a plane has gone down in D.C. And she said, I just talked to him this afternoon. He was in Wichita. And we knew. Unfortunately, a lot of the emergency response did not work out. We were not notified by PSA or American for several days. We're still not certain why that happened. We were actually in NTSB briefings in DC, and they were still trying to track us down to notify us. We got notification from the medical examiner that they had recovered Sam prior to actually getting confirmation that he was on the flight. So I've talked to a couple of you here about that whole notification process. I feel very adamant that someone who knows the family needs to be part of that, but Fireside was involved also at, you know, a great gesture that FlexJet made, bringing them in to take care of us. So Fireside really brought a lot of the understanding of the process and walked us through that process and helped us understand everything that was going to happen. They were great at handling people who were in shock, but also having some folks from FlexJet there, having PSA show up. You know, their director of flight ops was right there with us every day, and that personal touch really meant a lot to us as a family. Having the president of PSA call us on the telephone, you know, all sorts of American executives were calling us and reaching out to us, and that was really critical. So I do want to emphasize, when you look at putting together your emergency response, you've really got to think about who are those family members going to want to hear from, who do they have relationships with. So I'm going to step down now and let Tim go into some of the more technical issues about the situation at DCA, and also some recommendations that we have. We have been hitting Capitol Hill pretty aggressively. We've already met with the Secretary of Transportation, multiple senators, a few congressmen. And what we're asking you, it was a challenge that you guys heard earlier. You know, I posted on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago. I worked at Gulfstream for 15 years. You guys know, we all say, see something, say something. But a lot of times we say it, and the people to whom we say it don't act. So we've really got to start demanding action. So that's my request to you. If your reports are falling on deaf ears, escalate that, because like Tim said, these human lives are worth a lot more than $11 million. And if you're trying to do a cost-benefit analysis for your company, I work in IT, I have to have a business case for everything I do. But if your company's not considering intangible benefits, you need to push them. That's an incomplete picture if they're only looking at the financial costs.
Thank you, honey. I want to talk a minute about, kind of stray off of my conversation and talk about your care team. And I only know FlexJet's care team, as I've only needed it. The care team that we had in the Army was not so good. But like I said, I was in Teterboro, and well, by the time I figured out what was probably going on, I called and, you know, I had an early flight. Hey, I can't fly tomorrow. And almost immediately, maybe 15 minutes, the chief pilot called me up and says, hey, I understand that you've got some issues going on, and what do you need? Well, I need to get to DC. They sent me a driver with a car to get me there. He said, where's your family? I said, they're in Savannah, Georgia. Okay, we're sending a Challenger. Will they be ready to go at 9 in the morning? And then when we got to DC, was my family got there, they got met by a care team. And that care team is so invaluable, because something like this happens to you, and it happens to one of your pilots, it happens to one of your passengers, it doesn't really matter. We're all in shock. We have no idea who to talk to, what to do. We don't even believe it's true. It takes a while to get that information to really sink in, that this really happened. It happened to somebody that we really, really love. And so that care team is so important. So if you're in a smaller organization and you don't have the resources to put together a care team, it's well worth your while to maybe add somebody like Fireside, or there was another operator here actually who does this similar to what Fireside does, and even band together with other operators to put a care team together. So there was that. All right, let's talk a little bit about the actual accident. So American Airlines 5342, they go by the call sign Blue Streak, okay? The pilot and the co-pilot, or the first officer was Sam, my son. He had just almost 2,500 hours. He came out on the next captain upgrade list because you need 1,000 hours of 121 time. And so he was just about to make captain. Jonathan, the captain of that flight, he had about 4,000 hours, and about 3,000 more in the CRJ because he had come on with a restricted ATP. So, still, I considered them new to the industry, but they were going places, right? And so far, we haven't found any evidence that the Blue Streak was in anywhere but the place they were supposed to be, flying exactly the way they were supposed to fly. Okay, PAT-25 is a Blackhawk. It was a aluminum metal Blackhawk configured just pretty much like this picture with external stores on. They were doing a check ride, so an annual 8-part evaluation, and what they're going to do is they're going to put the NVGs on, they're going to go out and do some maneuvers and some emergency procedure training, then they're going to fly the route back to their base, and then, they'll do some traffic patterns at the end, right? So the most experienced person in that aircraft was the crew chief. He had about 1,200 hours riding around the back of the aircraft. The Army's been saying that there's a highly experienced crew. I have a problem with that statement, and I think it's a leadership failure if that's the highly experienced crew that the Army has. What the Army has is a retention problem, because over the last decade, the average experience of an Army aviator has dropped to 300 hours. And even the instructor pilot had less than 1,000 hours. The person taking a check ride who was qualified as a PIC had about 450 hours. They were both good, honorable people, serving their country and doing what they had signed up to do, but there was a lot of reasons they got set up for failure, and a lot of that had to do with the culture of the unit they were in. And we're going to talk about that culture, even though we're not mostly operating in a military environment, because it's very similar to the cultures that we can have in our own flight operations. All right, so these are the military routes for the helicopters. When I learned them, we didn't have iPads, we use these, right? And there's a lot of good information on this map that you might not pick up when you read it on the iPad, because it's in the data that's on the outside of the map, right? So there's a description of what the route is supposed to be, and it's written out. And one of the things it says about Route 4 is along the east bank of the Potomac River. Now, it's important, and the NTSB will point it out, that there's nowhere on this map that says how wide that route actually is. So are you on the route if you're on the east bank or if you're in the middle of the river? I don't know. But the way I learned it, you fly it with one wheel over land and one wheel over water. Apparently that's not the standard that they maintain anymore. I'm going to preface this that there's a lot of things that are still unknown and not for certain. I'm going to try to talk about the things we know for certain, and then I'm going to tell you some of the things that are kind of more opinionated that are coming from me from my experience of flying those routes and flying in the Army. All right, so the CRJ, when they were doing their approach, they were cleared to do the Mount Vernon visual. Probably 90% of you guys have done the Mount Vernon visual on the runway 1. So they're coming in this way, and about the time they get to Wilson Bridge, they're asked if they can circle to land runway 33, which is this one. All right, so you're going to end up doing this. If you listen to the air traffic control tapes, my son was the one pilot monitoring, because he answers the radio and says, we can do 3-3. All right? So as they're coming, they're circling, doing 3-3, they're configuring. They're very close to on the proper glide path. And they're configuring, as best I can tell, they were doing everything right. I don't have a complete transcript. Just excerpts of what the NTSB told us that they said. So for instance, I'm not for sure if they made their 500-foot stabilized call. They did hear an audio 500-foot, and they were configured and ready to go. They did get a traffic. I believe it was like 17 seconds before impact. And I don't know what the conversation in the cockpit was for that, but 1 second before impact, there's an expletive, which I believe is my son saying, oh fudge, the helicopter. And the controls go to a full-scale deflection, near full scale is what the NTSB said, near full-scale deflection. So That happened to happen really fast. Again, I don't know if Jonathan pulled the yoke back or if Sam did, because just the time amount that they had to try to survive that thing. But it was too little too late. It didn't help. All right, so Pat 25, they're starting up here at Cabin John. And the way this route works on Route 1 is it starts Cabin John at 1,300 feet, and it steps down until you get to 200 feet right here at Memorial Bridge, right? And so they ask for Route 1 to Route 4, which is pretty standard if you're trying to transition and get back here. And when they get to Key Bridge, which is right here, you're supposed to be at 300 feet, right? 300 feet or below. All these routes are predicated on doing a 500-foot rate of descent or climb to stay on altitude. And they're all predicated on you staying at the maximum altitude unless weather requires you to go lower or ATC asks you to go lower. So they get to Key Bridge, and then there's a conversation in the cockpit where the instructor pilot says we're at 400 feet, and the pilot flying says we're at 300 feet. And so there's some kind of disagreement, and we still don't know exactly why, whether they had a different perception or whether their altimeters were actually reading differently. In the Army, the altimeter error allowed is 70 feet, and so you could technically have a legal altimeter and you could be reading 100 feet different because, you know, I'm a little off up and you're a little off down. It could happen. So we don't know if that's the issue. The NTSB has said that the pressure altitude readings that were in the data are corrupted and not usable. So they're trying to get to the bottom of that. We'll see how that goes. We do know that radar altimeter was working and working quite well, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. So they get here, they have this conversation, but then they don't really resolve it, right? And as they get to Memorial Bridge, the instructor says, we're at 300, we need to be at 200, and the other pilot says, I'm getting down to 200. Okay, about this time, they call Memorial Bridge, and the air traffic control tower gives them the traffic. And they say, your traffic is a CRJ just south of Wilson Bridge, 1,200 feet, circling to land, 3-3. The transmission where they said circling to land is not on the cockpit voice recorder of the Blackhawk. It is on the CRJ, it is on the tower tapes. So either the Blackhawk stepped on it, for some reason they didn't get the circle to land. They did get the 3-3. Very unfortunate they didn't call back and go, what again? They didn't ask for clarification. And we're going to talk about the visual separation. So they said traffic in sight requests visual separation. All right. I've been flying for 40 years professionally. I've never once asked for visual separation. Has anybody in here ever, as a pilot, requested visual separation? I don't know any other place it's ever done. When I flew these routes, we didn't ask for it. But talking to all the guys that fly these routes now, that's their standard. As soon as they get told there's traffic, they ask for visual separation. Why did they learn to take that shortcut? It had become a cultural norm to take that shortcut. Because if they didn't, they'd have to do what we used to do. When we got to Haynes Point, if somebody was on approach to 3-3, we either had to turn and go down Route 6, or we had to hold at Haynes Point. Well, they didn't want to do that because they wanted to go where they wanted to go. So anyway, as they pass Haynes Point, the air traffic control tower is starting to get a collision, a traffic warning, right? You can hear it in the air traffic control tapes that they call out to the Blackhawk, confirm you have the CRJ in sight. Pass behind the CRJ. Again, the instructor pilot steps on that transmission and he doesn't hear all that transmission. He doesn't hear pass behind the CRJ. he stepped on it. He doesn't ask for clarification. He says to the pilot who's taking the evaluation, they want us further to the east. All right? So, again, we talked about this route. It's supposed to be along the edge of the river. They were more like in the middle. This is the ADS-B information from the CRJ, plotted as it actually was, and this is where they ended up. So that the impact happened somewhere in here. I ask you, is this the edge of the river? Doesn't look like the edge of the river to me. Okay, so the radar altimeter on the Blackhawk at impact, 278 feet, okay? So we don't know for sure what the barometric altimeter said. We know the radar altimeter said 278 feet. 14 feet is the altitude of the airport. So we're talking pretty close. MSL and radar altimeter are gonna be pretty darn close to each other. All right, the last 5 seconds, the Blackhawk is flying. They don't flinch. The instructor pilot says we need to be further to the east, but they don't turn east. They just continue straight ahead. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have worn NVGs, but one of the NVG 101 is to have your head out the cockpit, scanning constantly, scanning constantly, scanning constantly. That could not have possibly been happened, because even if you mistook and you thought there was another aircraft that was on approach to 1 is what you're looking at, within a few seconds of hitting an aircraft, you're going to see it and you're going to flinch. That didn't happen. Nobody was looking out that window. So when we talk about getting back to the basics, this is what we're talking about. Got to look out the window when you're in a high traffic area. Whatever they were looking at, I don't know. And when we get the real transcripts of all of that, what was going on in that cockpit, we might get a better idea, but for now we don't know. I'm hoping the NTSB gives us that information. All right, so we talked about when they first asked for visual separation. The Blackhawk is 6.5 miles away from the CRJ when they asked for visual separation. If you've ever looked through NVGs, it looks a lot like that original video that was showing on the news. All you're gonna see of another aircraft, because they're at 200 feet in an area of lots and lots of man-made lights. So from 6.5 miles away, all you're gonna see is a light. And you're gonna assume, well, is that my aircraft? You can't tell how far away it is, because the NVG limitation is your depth perception is gone, right? So you're seeing all these lights, you see one light, and are you gonna make an assumption that's the one you're looking for? It's kind of a crazy idea. But again, it had become the cultural norm. All right, so you also do have a 40-degree field of view, so you need to be scanning. And then there's all these bright lights. And you're at 200 feet. There's a doggone Ferris wheel out here. So there's that. All right. When they're told again to confirm you have the aircraft in sight, what do? They come back and say, affirmative, request visual separation. It was the way they had been programmed. They had been taught that by the guys that taught them how to fly those routes. It was a shortcut that they took because that's what they knew. So they didn't have the aircraft in sight, obviously. They said they did, and they requested visual separation once again. Again, when you're looking from here, all you're probably going to see is bright lights. There was an aircraft that had just taken off. They may have thought that's what they were looking for. There was another one on approach to 1 that was pretty far out. Now, when you look down the river and you see a big light, you may think that's the guy that you're looking for, okay? Let me go back one. It's important to note, and I think I said it before, the Blackhawk crew made no evasive maneuver, so they could not have been looking out the window. Let's go back. All right, so The NTSB took a 3-year look back, approximately 3 years, and they found, and they called it intolerable risk. All right, so we had at least one TCAS RA per month during that 3-year look back. And in those TCAS RAs, 2/3 of them were at night, and most of them, and these were between airplanes and helicopters. And most of them, the helicopters were above the route, at least half of them, but the data is a little inconclusive. 15,000, we're not talking 1,500, 15,000 times that an airplane and a helicopter within 1 mile and 400-foot vertical separation. Okay, just to put that in perspective for the number of operations that happened at that airport during those 3 years, 1 in 62 commercial aircraft were within 1 mile and 400 feet. Okay, 85 times in those 3 years, 85 times. There was a lateral separation of less than 1,500 feet and less than 200 feet vertical, 85 times. All this data was in ACSF. When they said, oh, let's look at the data, they went to the voluntary reporting systems that we're talking about and have been talking about and pulled this data. This was all here. So they talk about aviation regulation being written in blood. Let's write aviation regulation in data, in analytics. Let's write it in a way where we can keep the accident from happening before it happens. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about intolerable risk here again. What we knew about this route, and I do not to this day understand why they changed the standard. When I flew those routes, we always held at Haines Point if somebody was on approach to 3-3, or we went a different way. Somewhere along the line, all this asking for visual separation, I think, again, this is my opinion because I don't know how it became, the air traffic controllers became used to that and started letting them take that route. We know in 2018 there was a near miss there under almost exact circumstances, except for it was during the day. Okay? This became a training event for the air traffic controllers. But apparently nobody learned that maybe we should not put aircraft on Route 4 when somebody's on approach to 3-3. Now, if everybody was exactly, and who likes this movie, My Cousin Vinny? I love that movie. I have a little demonstration from My Cousin Vinny. So if the Blackhawk was exactly where it was supposed to be, and we already said it was not exactly where it was supposed to be, it would be flying down Route 4. If the CRJ was exactly on glide path to 3-3, there would be 75 feet between the 200-foot maximum and the glide path. Now, the tail rotor of the Blackhawk sticks up about 17 feet when you're in straight and level flight. So that leaves us 58 feet of clearance. What do we got here? 58 feet of clearance. That's how much clearance between a Blackhawk tail rotor and a CRJ flying on that route. Like, that's insane. The wake turbulence alone would cause a hazard that is just unacceptable. Not to mention, if anybody is just a hair off, this is what happens. Just a hair. All right, thank you guys. The wingspan of a CRJ is greater than 75 feet. So we're not even talking about a wingspan of the aircraft. All right. I'm going to talk about the culture that was going on in the 12th and in the Army. And really what I want to say is that this is a leadership failure on the part of the Army. They spent the last decade, I believe, you know, even though I love Army aviation and I spent 20 years of my life there, letting things go. All right? So, the risk analysis, I haven't been able to see the actual risk analysis. I've been told by several pilots, and I've seen a whole bunch of experts on podcasts and TV saying this was a low risk, and this was a low risk because it's something we did every day. Well, guess what? Just because it's something you do every day doesn't make it a low risk, because those same guys who tell you how low that risk was tell you how challenging it is to fly that route under NVGs under those conditions. You can't have it to be super, super challenging and difficult and low risk at the same time. So there was a bunch of risk mitigation that could have taken place that wasn't taking place. I knew back in the 80s when I watched two Blackhawks run together, and the outcome of that safety investigation said, we need to have 4 crew members on a Blackhawk every time it flies NVGs. But only 3 were on that aircraft. So we knew the best practices already were 4. Now they tell me, well, NVGs, the visual acuity has increased dramatically since then. Well, that's true, but they're still 40 degrees, right? So we knew we could mitigate risk by putting an extra guy. We didn't do it. They didn't have their ADS-B out turned on. Come to find out, they weren't using ADS-B out at all in Class B airspace. The NTSB, I recently found out during the congressional hearings, went out and checked some of the aircraft. Some of them didn't even work, the ADS-B out didn't even work. That particular aircraft that was flying that day, the ADS-B hadn't transmitted in 700 days. It had not been received by anybody. So when the FAA gave the Department of Defense the waiver to fly in Class B without the ADS-B operating out, the waiver said this would not be used as an everyday waiver. This is going to be the exception, not the rule. But the Department of Defense decided that wasn't good enough, and they just did it 100% of the time, almost never used ADS-B. I talked to a lot of Blackhawk pilots in the last 2 months that are actively flying. About half of them could even tell me how to turn ADS-B on and turn it off. Didn't even know how to use it. All right? They weren't wearing the hood, okay? They had available the hood, they didn't wear it. What would the hood have helped them do? It'll help them maintain their altitude and their airspeed while still looking out the aircraft. They don't have to scan inside as much. They had the hood available, didn't wear it. They didn't consider the time of the mission, right? If they went a little bit later, they could have flown that route during a time when very little traffic was at DCA. If they went late enough, there would have been no traffic at all because they closed down. They were flying that L model, okay? Mike models are in that unit. Now, they don't have enough for everybody to fly Mike model all the time, and that's something I'd like to see them change. The Mike model has altitude hold, and it's got digital screen and everything. The L model is steam gauges, hand flying. So they could have been more likely on altitude had they been flying a Mike model. So they didn't take any of those risk mitigations because this was a low risk. All right. All right. So, and I talked a lot already about requesting visual separation and that they were not really on the prescribed route and they were above route altitude. They didn't scan. They had communication failures that they didn't come back and ask for clarification on. And one of the things that I kind of touched on earlier during one of the other presentations is, you know, the IP, he knew that they weren't on altitude because he said so. He knew that they weren't on the route where they should have been because he said so. But he didn't intervene because he didn't think it was that important. What had happened is we had gotten away, we had been lucky so many times flying those routes and that nobody had died doing it already. It had become the norm. We had accepted risk and normalized it. Said dangerous acts are okay because it hasn't failed us yet. All right, I'm not going to talk that much about ATC because that is not my area of expertise, but I will just tell you a few things. You know, they didn't use the standard phraseology. They had one air traffic controller working 2 frequencies. That everybody here knows that. That is not unusual. However, if you were going to go to 1 frequency there, 1 controller, it would really be great to go to 1 frequency because the CRJ never hears the Blackhawks transmissions. They hear the tower talking to the Blackhawk, but not the Blackhawk talking to the tower. The air traffic control never tells the CRJ about the Blackhawk. And they only learn it by hearing the traffic and then seeing it at the last second. Now, they could hear half of the transmission, so they had an idea there was somebody out there somewhere, but they didn't have any idea where. And then, of course, the air traffic controller could have deconflicted that traffic. When they were getting the traffic alert, and all they said was, confirm you have the CRJ in sight. That's kind of crazy, and their traffic controller may not, as far as I know, may not even been trained to understand that when you're looking through NVGs and you're trying to look for traffic, you're not going to know if it's a CRJ or if it's a King Air or whatever it is, because all you see is a light moving around in the sky, and it's very difficult to tell how far away it is. They obviously didn't see the CRJ at all. They were looking at something else. So I said all that, and I kind of let it out that I'm not happy with the Army. But what are we going to do? How are we going to fix this stuff? All right. So for me, I can't just let my son's death be, an oopsie, right? His legacy has to be that we're going to try to change some things. So we talked to the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy. Now, I do disagree with him when he said, oh, we should fire pilots, right? He's a good man, and he's trying hard to help us. So we met with him one day, and to be fair, a lot of the ideas that we told him we were looking for, he was already working on. But the very next day, he got on TV and laid out his plan to modernize, to increase ATC staffing and kind of supercharge that. We talked a lot about data analysis, and so the FAA is now working on a program where AI is going to actually find these hotspots before they become death spots, right? We're going to figure out where that next accident is going to happen and avoid it from happening. And then, of course, they did the route updates. Route 4 is all but closed now. It can only be flown by air ambulance with actual patients on board, and it can be flown by law enforcement when they're actively doing law enforcement, but they're going to shut down landings to 3-3 and departures from 1-5 during that time. So they are working on an alternate route. It hasn't been decided exactly where that's going to be yet. The FAA, their position has been, we know we screwed up, we know we can do better, and this is how we're going to do better. One of the things the families asked for was a review of the tower at DCA. I mean, there's been fistfights there. There's been a T-38 that, was screaming through there, and they still let a Delta flight take off. So there's a lot of issues at DCA Tower. The staffing levels have been difficult. Their own SOP says they weren't supposed to combine that frequency until 9 o'clock. And so how did it got combined very early in the day. I think it was like 3:30, somewhere around there. So there's a lot of issues with DCA, but the FAA is working hard to actually fix them, right? And they're reviewing like, hey, why do we got all our flights coming in the last 30 minutes of the hour, and then all our departures the first 30? Can we figure out a way to stagger that so that the workload is more even? All kinds of things that they're trying to do to fix it. The Army, on the other hand, not so much, right? The Army's idea has been delay, defer, deny. They're hiding behind the NTSB. They haven't made any commitment to change anything they've done wrong. They won't admit they did anything wrong. The only thing I've got them to commit to is to some training. All right, so we've gone to Congress. We're asking for legislation, and I'm going to challenge you all. When the legislation comes up, they're going to need a lot of money. They're going to need a lot of funding to upgrade the air traffic control system. I think it's super important. I don't know if that would have for sure kept this accident from happening, but it's going to keep the next one hopefully from happening. I mean, we are literally working with Flintstones technology when, we're, the Jetsons age, right? So they're going to need funding. When that legislation comes up, we don't call it bipartisan, we call it nonpartisan, because I don't care if you're a libertarian, Democrat, or Republican. Aviation safety everybody flies. Aviation safety should be important to everybody. And so I'm going to challenge you to get on the bandwagon, write your congressman, ask them to vote for that when it does come up, and it will. They're going to increase the accountability. Senator Cantwell has been a real champion in saying that the FAA has just been too lightly handed, especially on military and 121 operations. And then, of course, Ted Cruz. I don't even want to get into the things he said, but I was sitting in a briefing, and Cantwell says to the director of the FAA, a lot of the families are in there. It's not these families' full-time job to maintain aviation safety. It's yours. And I mean, it's an important message. You know, why does an accident like this have to happen and have families advocating for safety when there's people whose job it is to do that? And you know, everybody in this room is alongside trying to get the safety done. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but what we need to do is bring others along with us and keep banging that drum, right? So accountability. General Brahman, he testified before Congress that every commander is held responsible for the risk decisions that they make. I don't find that to be true. Nobody's been held accountable in the Army yet, but we're trying to fix that. And then, of course, oversight, legislative oversight we're going to need. The DOD, I pretty much talked about all this stuff, but in my research, trying to figure out what's going wrong in the Army, I found a lot of stuff that's really happened in the last, since I retired in 2006, but since then, the number of senior aviators has decreased dramatically. So I would say it's kind of like having your teenager teach your other teenager how to drive. They might figure it out, but they just don't have that deep knowledge to be able to pass it on. You know, what's the right way to get this done? So they're going to just follow what the other guy did. The training, from what I'm hearing, and I don't have any actual data to back this up, but I recently heard of a young lieutenant who showed up at her unit and could not hover a Blackhawk. So what am I getting at is the Army's training has decreased their standards so much because they just can't keep enough Army aviators that they're willing to put people through flight school and graduate them who just can't do the job. It's not for everybody. If you can't hover a Blackhawk, you can't be a Blackhawk pilot, right? If you can't fly an airplane, you can't be an airplane pilot. It's terrible, but it's just one of the truths of our industry. I'm going to be the first one to tell you, only by the grace of God have I not caused an accident. I've made a lot of mistakes, okay? So when I'm talking about the mistakes these other people made, I don't get the idea that I'm pointing the finger at them. I'm just saying on this night, all those mistakes lined up, and it caused a catastrophic accident. It never had to happen. Didn't have to happen because air traffic control. It didn't have to happen because just the very design of these routes. Today was the first day I heard that there was a white paper written years and years ago describing this exact scenario. Nothing was done about it, okay? One of the problems that we found is that the Army's reporting system and the Department of Defense's safety reporting system is not compatible with the FAA's reporting system. So the Army will tell you that they didn't really know all of these near misses and close calls were happening, although there's plenty of evidence that they did know. However, if that data could combine, and so this is one of the things we're pushing for, then everybody will have the same information, okay? And we gotta be able to communicate between the civilian and the military side, all right? And we really just need the military to commit to putting the lives of civilians at a higher priority. I just want to leave you with a couple thoughts, and the board that was up here pretty much said everything that I'm about to say, and I wrote this before I knew I'd never been to the safety symposium before. So, but safety is not proprietary. Everybody in here and all of our competitors, we all need each other to step up and be safe, but we also need to pass this information to everybody else. As we find hot spots, it wouldn't be enough for FlexJet just to know that a hot spot is Boca, right? What we need to know is everybody who flies in and out of Boca needs to know that's a hot spot and how to prevent having a collision there. And so we need to share that data. We need to share lessons learned. We got to push for positive change. And that's where I'm going to challenge you again. When the legislation comes up, take 10 minutes to write your legislator and say, we support this. I talked about emergency action plans before, but I'm really going to push it home. No matter what size operator you are, you've got to plan for the very worst thing to happen. You've got to plan that every flight that goes out isn't going to come back. No matter how safe we are, an accident's going to happen. Let's hope that the next one's at least 15, 20, 30 years away. But when it does happen, it is so important that you have a plan, that you protect the lives that can be protected. You take the lessons learned from that accident and you push them out just as fast as you can. Now, NTSB is going to take another probably at least a year and a half before we get the final thing on this accident. However, there's stuff that we know right now. Let's fix what we know right now. Even if there's stuff that we're speculating about that didn't maybe cause the accident, but we found is a hazard, let's fix that now. And then when the NTSB comes out with their final recommendations, which on this one, the NTSB came out with some recommendations when they did the preliminary, and they were spot on. In fact, they were the same things that we asked Senator Duffy, or Secretary Duffy, to do about a week before it came out, which was pretty much close Route 4. But anyway, let's get that stuff done. Now, I went a little early. Maybe everybody wants to get to the Cracker Barrel. I don't know. But if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Go ahead, sir. Yes, the PSA TCAS did go off. And I'll be the first one to tell you, I misunderstood ADS-B until this happened. I had to do a little bit of research. TCAS doesn't need ADS-B to work. It works on transponders interrogating each other, and then it calculates the closure rate. I thought that CRJs had ADS-B in. They do not, at least not the ones at PSA.
So how would PSA, for example, I guess, see other traffic other than visually if they don't get ADS-B in?
The TCAS.
Oh, okay.
So the
That's what
TCAS is, the way it does is the transponder is setting out an interrogation. Other transponders answer it. Then it says, oh, it took, 0.002 seconds to come back. He must be this far away and in that direction. And it takes the Mode C and the Mode S data and adds that in.
So then my other question is there anything the FAA can even do to hold the military accountable? Because if I buy a drone off of Amazon, I need remote ID, but apparently, an Army Blackhawk doesn't even
yes. So the FAA has already made a zone where they're at DCA where there's no longer an exemption for ADS-B out to be transmitted. Now, that doesn't mean that that they should not have it on in the rest of the Class B airspace. They should. And I think that we're going to see some legislation or some changes to the way that waiver is written so that they're going to have to use it at least on a regular basis. There's no reason for them to not use it when they're flying a training flight. They're going to say, because we're trying to keep everything a secret, but it's no secret they're flying up and down that route. And it's kind of a ridiculous premise.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir.
Physically impossible for the CRJ to have seen the Blackhawk? That's all I had.
Physically impossible?
cockpit?
No, pretty unlikely, though. They're rolling out on 3-3, and they're concentrating on getting a stabilized approach. They don't know that Blackhawk is where it is. Somebody 1 second before impact, I believe it was Sam, saw the Blackhawk and made an expletive and pulled the controls. So they did see it at the last second. It'd be very difficult to see it. Now, as you're descending in a CRJ, you know, your forward and down visibility is pretty limited. And on top of that, that Blackhawk is flying in an area of lots of man-made lights. And so even its lights are kind of blending in. So it's a miracle they saw each other at all. Yes, sir. I asked a lot of that questions. My understanding, what I got from them was all that data was in a SIAS. And so what I think that, and you could probably tell me better how they got that data, but my understanding is they just farmed it out of a SIAS. And from all the CRJs that have been landing there and all the other airliners that have been landing there, had been voluntarily putting their data in, and it's all in there. All they had to do was go, hey, how many times was this aircraft within so many feet of another aircraft, and was it a helicopter, you know? How they mined it exactly, I'm not certain. Yes, sir.
Would ATC have known that Blackhawk would have been using NVGs on this kind of flight?
That's a good question. I'm not sure about that. They don't report to air traffic control. I never have that whether I was wearing NVGs or not. So it would be the air traffic controller probably doesn't know this, but it would be an exception to the rule for you not to be wearing NVGs at that time of night. Now, a good pilot flying NVGs at 200 feet in an area of lots of man-made lights would either flip them up occasionally, or they would look under them like this. You can't tell the color of other lights. So if you went in to see position lights, for example, you're looking through NVGs, it's no-go. You can't see position lights.
I think we got a question in the back. Oh, you got it answered? Okay.
Sir?
Has there been any discussion about enhancements to TPS systems? I noticed there was only 2 seconds between, I believe it was 2 seconds between traffic and
I think it was 17 seconds. They got traffic. I have to look that up, but I think it was 17 seconds they got traffic. It's not unusual to get traffic, as you know, on approach because you got somebody else taking off or whatever. And so they're just probably looking around going, where's that traffic, you know? And then, of course, 1 second before, they actually saw it and was able to pull. I guess I really didn't talk about the actual accident. They had about 3 to 4 seconds, this is what I've counted, that aircraft was completely out of control and they were trying to fly it. You know, it's a terrible thing to think about your kid going like, here we go. And I want to say one of the worst parts of this experience was the day after the accident. So what happens is the families and the friends of people on that flight, they get a NTSB brief about an hour before the media gets it. So the very next day, we're sitting in an NTSB brief. I'm sitting in a room with about maybe this many people. It's full of orphans and widows and people who just lost their children. First guy who gets up there is the fire chief. He gets up there and says, it was a horrific scene. Body parts spread all over the ice. About 6 or 8 women just went into hysterics and ran out of the room. It's an experience I just can't explain, just how devastating it can be. But it was. And especially when you know, like, this is so preventable. This didn't have to happen. And it happened with people that I would have flown with. You know, these Blackhawk pilots, I would have flown with these guys. They were good people, but they just made a lot of mistakes that night, and so did the system, and so did air traffic control. So, I mean, yes, sir.
Let me just add a little bit. The data that we got from the NTSB, we requested through ACSF. We have to be very specific about what we're asking for. I would say be careful with that data at this point. It's very preliminary. That 15,000, we don't really know what all that means. That may be multiple sources in those numbers for the same event. We don't know for sure. Okay, we have a lot of more questions on that. The other thing about the TCAS stuff, remember, they're not going to get any RAs below 900 feet.
Right.
Okay, the system's not designed for that. We have recommendations out there from all the near misses, the runway incursions out there for the new technologies, and there's a couple avionics manufacturers that are working on that so we don't have these incursions or runway incursions and stuff. That technology may be helpful for something below those altitudes where TCAS is not going to work. I don't know that yet. I have a lot of questions of these avionics manufacturers for that, but I think that's a technology that may be useful down the road that may help in this case. But yeah, just be careful with these numbers because we don't have a lot of information on it yet. We have a lot of questions, and it's preliminary.
Right. We do have a lot of technology that's still not completely being used, and I'll just use an example. He talked about runway incursions. If you're ordering a new aircraft for your fleet and you've got to decide whether or not to have the charts come up on your screen, if you say, oh, that's pretty expensive, let's not do that. Okay, I see where you're coming from. But if just once you save an aircraft from running into another aircraft, you've just saved that entire subscription for the next, 30 years, the amount of money that you saved. So investing in the technologies that are out there, it's worth it.
Anybody else?
Anybody else?
Yeah, I just think it's worth saying thank you for being up here and doing this.
Well,
I operate in the DC all the time. We have helicopters that go down there. I got 4 little kids. I think what you're doing for safety promotion right now is going to be more impactful to all these people in the safety community than probably anything else we're going to see today. So, as a father and as somebody that does, what you do and what your son did, this is going to make a big impact.
I appreciate that. And I'll tell you what, it's as much for me as it is for the whole industry. Doing stuff like this helps me sleep at night. I haven't had a full night's sleep since this happened, but I'm getting there, and this is how I get it off my chest.
Anybody else? Tim, Sherry, thank you so much for sharing your story. This has been, I can't imagine what you all went through. So thank you again for sharing.
I appreciate that. It was a pleasure to be here. Sherry wants to say one more thing.
One thing that we did not mention, and I would ask all of you to just keep in mind, there were 66 other families devastated by this incident also. We are in very close communication with other family members, collaborating with them on a daily basis. We've got a lot of different special interest groups looking at advocacy, just supporting people, et cetera. So just keep them in mind. And like Tim keeps saying, in addition, the service members' families, that young crew chief was 28 years old with a small child. So our hearts go out to those families too.
Yeah, out of the 67 people, every family member that I've met and talked to about their loved one, I don't believe there's one single person out of 67 I wouldn't want to have been friends with. We had some kids that were going to probably go to the Olympics ice skating. We had people who I would love to go hunting with. We had high-powered executives. We had lawyers, and just some really great people were on that flight. Just all the Swiss cheese we always talk about came together that night.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, baby.